Hi, thank you for joining us today for the webinar on employee safety in the time of coronavirus, Strategies for Safety-Related Behavior Change. My name is Amy Bucher, and I'm the VP of Behavior Change Design here at MadPow. I'm happy to be here today to talk to you about this important topic as we are all experiencing the global COVID-19 pandemic and thinking about ways that we can safely return to work. So the key question I'll be focusing on today is how can managers create the conditions for employee safety in a pandemic? And a thing I want to be very straightforward about is that when I talk about creating the conditions for employee safety, I'm really talking about how do we shape the environment so that employees can behave in a particular way. I'm not a safety expert myself, so I won't be talking a lot about the specific safety measures that you might be implementing. Instead, as a behavior scientist, I'll really be talking about employee motivation, the way that they perceive the world, and the ways that you can help create a context that allows them to behave in a particular way. When you're evaluating your employees' ability to follow safety procedures, some of the things to keep in mind that I'll touch on as I go through the webinar today are, first of all, that being very clear about the specific safety behaviors that you'd like to see is extremely important. With behavior change design, one of our key first steps is always to define what we call the target behaviors, the things that we want people to do, and to do that in an incredibly specific way so that we can really be clear about how we're designing the conditions for that to happen. It's no different with safety behaviors. Another thing to keep in mind, and I will touch on this a few times, is that as we all live through this pandemic, cognitive load is quite high. Cognitive load essentially refers to being distracted, having your computing power applied somewhere else other than the task at hand. And with all of the different concerns and stressors that come with living through this time, everyone's under cognitive load. It means that we need to make things as easy as possible for people. Another thing that I'll point to a few times that's important to keep in mind is that risk assessment varies between people. Not everyone considers the risk to themselves and to their communities at the same level, and not everyone has the same belief about their ability to impact that risk. So we'll talk a little bit about those belief systems around risk, how those affect behavior, and how you might use communication to influence those risk perceptions. And then lastly, and I will spend quite a bit of time here because I think it's very important and it's something that behavior science specifically equips us to speak to, is the emotional experience of employees and how that matters in helping them to feel safe. So first, what does safe look like? And as I mentioned, I am not a safety expert, and we also are continuing to do science on the coronavirus, how to prevent its spread, how to treat it. So some of the specifics around what safety looks like may be changing as well. So what I'll say here is that physical safety policies are going to vary for you depending on the industry that you're in, the region of the country or the world that you're in. There will be local policies, local regulations that might influence what you're permitted to do or what's considered safe based on the virus's reproduction rate where you are. And other factors such as that. So I won't tell you exactly what they need to look like in your workplace, but I will say you should be looking at the best-in-class science and local regulations to determine that. And as I said before, a really important thing will be getting very specific about the safety behaviors that are right for your company and communicating those incredibly clearly to employees so that they understand what is expected of them. And also so that you, as managers, can craft the environment in a way that encourages those behaviors. So one of the things that's core to behavior change design when we think about behaviors is to understand what might stand in the way to people performing those today, and then to make sure that our design helps to combat those things. So we call them barriers. And I'm going to start by talking about some of the common barriers we might expect to see to coronavirus safety behaviors in a workplace. So what I will talk about is a little bit general. Again, it might vary depending on your specific industry or location. You're going to want to think critically about where this applies to your workspace. But at a high level, these are some of the phenomena that we're seeing. And I'm going to couch them in terms of the ConB model of behavior change. So the ConB model of behavior change basically says that for a behavior, the B, to occur, people need to have the capability, the opportunity, and the motivation to perform it. So this is one of the reasons why I say it's so important to be incredibly crisp about defining those safety behaviors, because we're going to look at each of those safety behaviors and then consider in terms of barriers where people might lack the capability, the opportunity, and the motivation to perform it. So for example, when you're talking about safety behaviors, you might think about wearing a mask or other personal protective equipment, PPE, in the workplace. You might think about maintaining 6 feet plus of physical distance between workers, or working alternate shifts so that there are fewer people on site at a given time. Those are very specific behaviors that we might consider, and then we're going to look at the barriers that are in place that might prevent people from engaging in those behaviors. Each of these 3 factors breaks down a little bit. When we think about capability, we're looking at people's psychological or physical ability to do a behavior. Do they have the knowledge and understanding they need to make the behavior happen? Are they physically able to do it, or do they have some kind of physical limitation where they might need a different type of assistance or an alternate way to get that behavior performed? Motivation breaks down into reflective and automatic motivations, where reflective motivations are the goals that people have in the priority order that they take. Automatic motivation is about the belief structures that people have. How do they see the world? What are their mental models? And within the mental models that they have, do these behaviors make sense? Do they help them achieve those desired goals? And then opportunity is about the environment in which the behavior takes place, both physically and socially. So another way to think about it that I really like is when you're thinking about the ConB behaviors, capability is really about the person, the body, and the mind. Motivation is about the heart, and opportunity is about the landscape in which the person stands. Once we understand what barriers exist, we want to look at solution sets, obviously. So it's not just enough to understand what might be making something hard, it's also understanding how we can make a design to address those things. The ConB model includes these intervention functions. These are categories of interventions that we might offer in order to overcome a particular set of barriers. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. I just wanted to point out what they were at a high level. So we have education, training, persuasion, which is really about inducing an emotional reaction to something. We have incentives and coercion, and both of those are naturally present in a workplace environment simply in the form of things like receiving a paycheck. That is an incentive. Restriction, which is really about rules and regulations. Environmental restructuring is one that we'll talk quite a bit about because it's one that's well within your control as an organization, really shaping the actual environment to make a behavior easier or harder to do. Modeling, really thinking about how are people at the top of the organization demonstrating the correct behavior pattern to people who are lower down in the hierarchy. And then enablement, which is really providing assistance that goes beyond, simple education or training. It might include things like tools in order to help people perform a behavior. One of the reasons that I like to use the ConB framework a lot to understand the barriers that exist and think about designing to overcome them is because it has this really nice decision tree that is part of the model, where they have reviewed quite a bit of literature and essentially said that if you observe barriers in one of these categories, you can also follow along and see what types of interventions are most likely to be effective at overcoming them. So I like to think of this as a way of really limiting the risk in designing an intervention, in the sense that if I know there is a psychological capability issue that's preventing people from engaging in a safety behavior, I also know that training, education, and enablement are the categories of intervention that are most likely to get me to an effective solution. So it's a way to narrow down the possibilities of design early in the process so that I can be exploring in the right space. And then even beyond that, we have a taxonomy of behavior change techniques. These are the specific active ingredients you might see in a solution. And this is a really handy list to use when we're brainstorming what our designs, what our interventions might look like. So I'm not going to go over this in great detail, but I just wanted to say that it's part of the model that I've used to put together some of the recommendations I'm about to share. So let's talk about some of the barriers that we know are likely to exist in many types of workplaces around employee safety behaviors. And I will say here that I'm making some assumptions about what safety behaviors might look like. So there's likely going to be some safety behaviors that are around personal protective equipment, PPE. So things like you see in the photograph here, this person wearing a face mask and eye protection, as well as other PPE unrelated to coronavirus. I'm assuming there will be some sort of physical distance safety behavior in play. So we know that having prolonged close physical distance to other people raises the risk of disease transmission, and so many workplaces are looking at ways to physically distance their workers from each other. There may also be use of things like physical barriers to accomplish that, or alternate timetables where you have employees working different shifts so that at any given time, a smaller percentage of your employees are on site together. So a little bit of that is baked in order to talk about the barriers, but I understand that you may have additional safety behaviors, or the flavor of those safety behaviors might look different for your organization. So let's start by talking about capability barriers, both physical and psychological. And what those would look like are people who don't understand how to do the safety behavior. So this might be someone who doesn't understand how to wear a piece of personal protective equipment so that it's effective. And there actually has been some confusion about wearing the mask over the nose. So there was a recent article that came out, a scientific article that showed that, yes, breathing through your nose also spreads the coronavirus. It doesn't just come through the mouth. And so some people need to be taught that the mask needs to securely fit at the bridge of the nose in order to cover both the mouth and the nose. That's an example. A big one that you're going to see is forgetting to do the behavior or falling into old habits. That's a psychological capability barrier. These behaviors are new for most people. Some folks work in environments where they're already used to wearing PPE and taking some safety measures. So, construction comes to mind, or some types of factory jobs. But for a lot of people, this is an entirely new world. And so it's very easy to forget that your routine has changed. And then the third piece, I mentioned before, cognitive load. There's a lot of that. And the thing to think about is that cognitive load reduces computing power. Think of the brain as a computer. We can only process so much information at a time. Psychologists use the term cognitive load to describe the active work that the human memory system is doing at any given time. So at a basic level, we have our working memory, and that's the memory that is taking on the job in the moment to process information and work with it so that we can make decisions and take actions. And then some of the information that comes into our working memory, or sometimes called short-term memory, gets encoded into our long-term memory, where we can remember it for a long period of time, maybe indefinitely. When the information's in our working memory, we're actively processing it, and we only have so much processing power. So if people are distracted by things like worrying about their risk level, worrying about childcare and how am I going to supervise my child who's now in virtual school and I don't have the reliable other adult in my life who can watch that person, or maybe folks in the family who are suffering from illness or other effects, or my income has really been hurt by the coronavirus, those sorts of things. Those reduce the computing power a person has in the moment to think about information and behaviors. So you've got to think about people being in this state of constant high stress and understand that the interventions that you need to put in front of them have to be all the stronger to overcome that. We need to make things incredibly easy for people right now because they are less capable than normal to exert the cognitive effort to deal with it. Another thing to keep in mind is that increased cognitive load means increased reliance on habits. So a habit is something that we do automatically or semi-automatically. There's a cue in the environment. We've learned to respond in a particular way, and it achieves the desired outcome. Habits are easy. They free up our mind to think about other things because we have the behavior loop down pat. And unfortunately, when we're under increased cognitive load, we are more likely to fall back into habits even when we don't intend to. I put the picture here of the car in the driveway because of a story that I have about my own cognitive load in life. About 10 years ago, I moved from Michigan, where I had lived for a number of years, to Boston, where I live now. I was still working in Michigan, and so I would fly back regularly to work out of the home office, and I stayed in a hotel and rented a car. It was pretty stressful, as some of you may know from having these sorts of long distance commutes. And I remember there was one day I was working in the office and it had been a tough day and it was dark outside and it was time for me to go back to the hotel. And so I got into my rental car and started driving. And then I found myself in the driveway of the house I lived in up until quite recently when I moved. And I turned off the car and opened the door and I was stepping out and I realized what actually made me realize that I had done this was I didn't have the house key because I didn't live there anymore. But because I was so stressed out and really absorbed in the events of the day, I wasn't thinking that my habit of driving home to this address and parking in this driveway is not going to serve me in this moment. I need to drive to the hotel instead. We're going to see similar things with workers where with the cognitive load that they're under, the stress that they're under, they're going to rely on some of those old habits. And those old habits are going to tend not to include things like putting on a face mask or putting on protective eyewear or consciously maintaining a physical distance from coworkers. So again, just really keeping it in mind and thinking about ways that you can make the new desired behaviors incredibly easy to do and make reminders about it really visible, really in the moment. So to go back to ConB and what it would recommend in terms of interventions for those physical and psychological capability barriers, first of all is if there's a knowledge barrier, if people don't understand how to perform a behavior, there's an opportunity to provide them with education and training around that. So detailed instructions on how to do things. One that was really common early in the pandemic were detailed instructions on hand washing, because of course we all know how to wash our hands, but it turns out many of us don't know how to wash our hands extremely well. And so there's been some, fun, different games and visual instructions and things to help people with that. As well as things like handling materials and surfaces, especially in shared spaces. And that's a place where the science has seemed to evolve pretty quickly. So there may need to be ongoing education about what is the latest, what is the newest thing that we understand about what to do safely here. For some things, it may even be necessary to offer coaching or expert demonstrations. So if you work in an environment where there's some kind of complicated sanitation procedure, for example, if you work in the healthcare facility, some of the ways that people have needed to use their PPE in those environments, it's a little bit more involved than just, your average person who's going out to run a quick errand and needs to wear more basic PPE. So in those cases, you may want to think about having more intensive training materials or experiences. Because of the cognitive load, this is particularly important, making sure there are reminders in the locations related to activities and that those are extremely visible, that they're hard to ignore. So think bold fonts, bright colors, eye level, something that people would have to actually move or change in order to get to the activity. So putting it on the handle of the fridge if you need somebody to handle the food inside differently. And then if you do work in an environment where there are checklists or procedures, updating the documentation so that it includes anything new related to safety. Physical opportunity barriers. Now this is about the physical environment in which the behavior takes place. And some of the barriers that are very common that we've actually seen in research about non-coronavirus safety behaviors are, first of all, not having the needed supplies in the right location at the right time. So oftentimes if people have to go looking around for hand sanitizer or a mask and they just need to do something really quick, the mental math says to them, hey, it's okay to just do this without the protection. That's not what we want. So let's make sure that the needed supplies are there. Sometimes there may not be an effective in-person version of an activity. So if you think about something like a boardroom meeting, if everyone is on site in the same facility and they want to have a meeting, it's really difficult to think about how to do that physically and safely at the same time. And so I'll talk a little bit about disrupting that mental model. And then the physical location itself might not support effective physical distancing. So it may be really physically small. I know that some folks in manufacturing settings have really had to think about how workers are positioned on the manufacturing floor because it's difficult for them to complete their job the way it's meant to be completed while also maintaining that physical distance that's recommended between each other. In terms of solutions, so first of all, making sure those needed supplies are available and stored near where people need them. So it's not just having them available, but again, similar to the reminders, putting them in the place where people don't have to go look for them. And they serve double duty in that case as well as a reminder. So I mentioned rethinking mental models, and meetings is a great example of that. In-person physical meetings in a small room that may not have great ventilation is not likely to be safe in the near term. So thinking about things like hybrid in-person virtual meetings or entirely virtual meetings, which I know a lot of us have quite a bit of experience with now, or rethinking the meeting at all. Is it possible to have a series of smaller conversations where you are lessening the aerosol load in the air because there's fewer folks involved in each individual conversation? Really rethinking that. And then thinking about how to facilitate social distancing with physical layouts when it is possible. So, if you can physically distance workstations from each other, there's been some usage of plexiglass or other materials to create barriers between open workspaces. An example that you may have already encountered in your world is many grocery stores now have one-way markers on the aisles so that they are limiting the ability of people to walk past each other closely. Those kinds of things can be helpful. Social opportunity barriers, these are about other people in the environment. And one of the big barriers that we see, and again, this is something we've seen in other safety behaviors as well, is management seen behaving differently from how employees are asked to behave. We as a species really look to other people for cues about what appropriate behavior is. And in particular, we look to people who are in positions of power. So in the case of a workplace, that is your managers. It's really important that managers model the correct safety behaviors because people will take their cues from them. Similarly, though, other employees not following safety behaviors and there not being consequences. It feels a little paternalistic. I think we're really not used to having to follow up on people about some of these sorts of things because many of us don't work in workplaces where there are these sorts of safety requirements. But following up on people who aren't observing them is really important. And letting others know that, yeah, if you're going to be in here and you're not wearing your PPE, you will be spoken to or there will be some other sort of consequence. And then employees not feeling empowered or comfortable asking others to behave a certain way. So maybe I notice that my colleague is not following a safety behavior and I don't feel comfortable bringing it up. Some of the solutions to this, so as I mentioned, management really has to walk the talk here and visibly engage in safety protocols. This is incredibly important, and it's a great opportunity for managers to be leaders. Social proof also supports behavioral adoption. There is some evidence that once around 25 to 30% of a population starts doing something, that's the tipping point where it becomes a more common behavior. So thinking about can you designate employee champions, folks who maybe are influential or popular in your workforce, and approach them individually and say, we would really like you to be the person who's the role model for doing these behaviors, is really visibly showing that this is the way that we do things now. As well as, again, being visible in congratulating folks who are observing safety behaviors well and saying something if it's not happening. Reflective motivation, as I mentioned, is about those goal priorities that people have. And the barriers really, it's that people have competing priorities. We all have a lot of things going on in our lives, and not even just within the workplace, but work and personal life present competing priorities in some situations. So even if people value safety, even if they say that's a priority, it may not always win out against things like getting your work done at a certain time or getting enough work done. Or, I can't get my work done today because I have these really important family obligations that just have to take priority. The other thing that happens is that we're really sensitive to what is being rewarded. And safety behavior typically isn't rewarded, even if managers talk about how important it is. And in fact, with coronavirus, one of the phenomena we're seeing is that people may see some consequences of safety behavior as punishing. So, a big example that I think we're seeing play out in a number of different arenas is that if people are exposed to coronavirus, they're asked to self-quarantine for a period of time to, limit their exposure to others, to stay home entirely. For someone who is an hourly employee and doesn't have financial assistance to make it through that sort of self-quarantine, following the safety behaviors is quite punishing. They don't have an incentive to make that a goal priority. And it's unfortunate because it's not good for their own safety and it's not good for the safety of the people around them. So in terms of solutions here, take every opportunity you have to reinforce that safety and well-being really are a top priority. So any employee communications that you send out, any conversations that you have, coming back to that point, really reinforcing it. And thinking about the incentives and penalties that you have in place for complying with safety behaviors. So there are ways that you could actually add incentives and penalties that might help with these sorts of things. We've seen in the construction space where, again, there's a lot of safety behaviors that need to take place, some reward structures that encourage people to speak up when they see colleagues not doing the right thing. And those tend to be surprisingly well received because they create a social understanding that, yes, you did say something to me about not wearing my safety glasses, but I also know that you did it for a really good reason, and so I'm not going to be mad at you about that. And in fact, I will put on the safety glasses. So you could think about similar things with coronavirus, but think carefully about that because, as I just said, right now there is kind of an inherent reward structure that rewards people coming to work even when they don't feel well or when they may be at higher risk. because they don't have a good alternative to that. And then I would also say where it's within your managerial powers, consider where expectations can adapt in order to let people have a little bit more wiggle room between those competing goal priorities. So you can think about things like buffers between meetings that give people time to wash their hands or change into a fresh mask. Introducing flexibility in work schedule if you have the type of work environment that permits that, so that if someone has to do elder care or child care, they can switch their own work hours so that they can make all of that fit a little bit easier within the day. And then maybe just reducing expectations if that's something that is possible for you and for your industry. Changing what you expect a person to produce in a period of time, knowing that the energy that they have in order to do that is going to be lessened. And then last one is automatic motivation barriers. And this is really about those mental models that people have, their understanding of how the world works. People don't accurately understand their level of risk and how their behaviors might affect that risk level. That is generally true of any type of risk, and it is specifically true about coronavirus. And it's in part because of this next point here, which is that we are receiving as a society many mixed and contradictory messages about what is the right thing to do. And that's very hard for people. And then people also feel like their individual behaviors don't matter much. We're talking about a public health threat, and for any individual person, the things that they do don't necessarily make an observable dent in the overall impact. So part of what we're dealing with here is helping people to feel like the things that they do matter. So what can you do here? So first of all, I would say don't downplay the seriousness of COVID-19 or potential infection. And I'm not saying that you need to ring the fire alarm about it, but keeping your communications about it sort of neutral in tone and hewed to the scientific evidence is helpful. If you underplay the seriousness, you also underplay the need for people to engage in safety behaviors, and that ultimately does not get you to where you need to be. Prioritizing credible and current information about the virus and the science. So, I would encourage looking at the World Health Organization or the Centers for Disease Control, these organizations that typically have tended to be, somewhat apolitical. And they're not necessarily like news organizations will want a headline that people click on. And so they may have an incentive sometimes to over or underplay a finding, where that's not usually the case with your CDC or your WHO. And then in terms of that making individuals feel like their behaviors matter, this is again where acknowledging people, thanking them, noticing the things that they're doing can really go a long way. So I do want to just touch briefly on communicating risk, because that is a key issue with the automatic motivation, the idea that people don't really accurately understand risk or their role in reducing risk. So risk communication could get its own webinar, and in fact, my colleague Jennifer Brazelli has recorded one that I highly encourage that you check out. I'm just going to touch on one behavior change model that has a role in risk communication, just to talk a little bit about some of the levers that you have available to push and pull as you think about talking to your employees. So this is the health belief model. It's a 45-year-old model that has been used in quite a number of health domains. And basically it says, first of all, people are different. That's what the box over here on the left with demographic variables and psychosocial characteristics means. Like we're all different, and the person that we are has an effect on how we intake information about risk. But then there are these various factors that influence whether we're actually likely to take action, do a behavior, when we're presented with a cue to action. So if someone asks me to put on my mask before I go into a store, this stuff in the middle of the model influences my likelihood to actually do that. So the first box here is perceived susceptibility and perceived severity. And these refer to how likely a person feels they are to actually get coronavirus in this case. That's their susceptibility. Am I likely to get infected? And if I do get infected, how bad of a thing is that really? So that's your perceived severity. So this is where information about the disease itself can help influence people's perception of risk. And we don't necessarily want to scare the pants off of people here. I think that's a natural tendency if we want people to engage in safety behaviors, is to say like, all right, let's really, really make them see that this is serious. We know that too much fear tends to cause people to withdraw. So if I'm really terrified about something, I'm not going to take any action. It's a way to manage my emotional reaction to that. Instead, we want something that's rooted in accuracy. Probably, it does make people a little bit anxious, but not overwhelmingly so. So stories can be really powerful here, exposing people to stories of others who are similar to them or people that they know who might have experienced coronavirus. When we see ourselves in someone else, it helps us to feel like that information is relevant. Really personalizing our approach here can also help. So talking about the science, but then talking about the slice of the science that's most relevant to a person. And that might come from something like demographic variables, or, there are some professions where people are more or less likely to be exposed to the virus because of the nature of their work. And tying that into the communication can be helpful. The next set here is perceived benefits and perceived barriers. This is the what's in it for me. Why do I care about doing this behavior? And I think some of this is self-evident with coronavirus, right? Nobody wants to be sick. Nobody wants to have, forget the serious health outcomes that some people experience. Even if you have a very mild version of it, nobody wants to feel lousy and like they have the flu. And so that's a very clear benefit to avoiding coronavirus. But there also might be really personal ways to talk about this as well, because we all have competing goals and priorities. And so there may be a way to talk to people in terms of the things that they're trying to accomplish and focus on in their lives, and how, taking care of themselves, staying safe can help them to do that. And similarly with barriers, of understanding what may make it hard for people to take a behavior, that helps you calibrate your communication to address it. And then this last box here is perceived self-efficacy. And this is people's belief that the things that they do will actually change outcomes. And you see sometimes that people have a low sense of self-efficacy about something like coronavirus. They feel like they can only hold it off for so long. This is such a contagious thing. So many people have it. How can I possibly stop myself from getting it too? And this again is where science communication can really help, as we get better and better evidence about what does and doesn't help people avoid transmitting COVID. So a big thing that is missing from this model that I do just want to pay lip service to, and again, I really recommend that you look at Jen's webinar on the MadPow website about science communication, is any discussion of motivation or identity protection. So as a scientist, I will say it's been really difficult to see scientific information about COVID filtered through a political lens, because it means that some people are less likely to believe the best available evidence, and then others are really eager to believe anything that they read, and so they're getting caught up in things that aren't as credible. And that's coming from a desire to reinforce their sense of identity, the way that they think about themselves and the groups that they believe they belong to. It's a really common, natural human phenomenon, but here it's working at cross purposes to keeping everybody safe. So I just want to put that out there to say that it's not as simple as just presenting the scientific evidence and then expecting people to believe it. There's more going on there, but the consistency in sharing credible evidence does make a difference over time. It does add up. And gradually what we're hoping to do here is create an environment where the good science is in surround sound, and it becomes easier for people to accept it regardless of how they identify, because it's just the way that we as human beings think about this shared crisis that we're in. I'm going to transition now and talk about psychological and emotional safety, which I think is really important. And I'm going to talk about why, because I think sometimes when I bring these things up, people say, well, that's the softer side. Like that's the warm and fuzzy stuff. Those are the soft skills. And the fact is, these matter a lot. And they matter for employee experience, they matter for employee satisfaction, and they matter for your bottom line as a business. So one thing that I think we, again, all know as people living through this is that the pandemic has been incredibly bad for mental health. A lot of our work at MadPow is in healthcare, and one of the things that we're seeing with our clients is that the demand for behavioral health services is increasing exponentially. This is from the CDC, and the most recent data that we have is a few months old because of just the time it takes to process surveys. So this is from late June. But as of then, 40% of U.S. adults said they were struggling with mental health or substance use. And you can see quite a lot of that here as anxiety or depression symptoms. So that's consistent with what you'll see in news reporting as well. And what it says, again, that cognitive load is up, people's ability to cope is down, and the services available to help them have not expanded since pre-pandemic. So, there is a shortage of mental health providers in the United States, and many of the people who are looking for assistance right now either aren't getting it or aren't getting enough of it. And that's important to know when we're thinking about the whole context in which employees are engaging in safety behaviors. Another thing is that economic health has really been hard hit by the pandemic, and that is, again, part of the emotional and the psychological person that comes to work each day. So this data is from the Commonwealth Fund, and it's from August, and it shows that if you look at the world, the global population, Americans are the most likely to have experienced negative economic consequences stemming from COVID-19. So this is the percent of adults in each country who were unable to pay for basic necessities like food, heat, or rent, or used up all or most of their savings, or borrowed money or took out loans to cover their costs because of the coronavirus pandemic. That's a pretty dire economic circumstance. And this means that people's goals are going to be shifting, right? They're going to be focused on survival. They're going to be focused on doing whatever it takes to get the food on the table and to make sure, in fact, that they have a table to sit at. Hard times send people down the pyramid. This is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's one of the oldest and most foundational models of motivation that we have in psychology. And it basically says that in order for people to perform at the highest levels, in order for them to get into, high performance or self-actualization, they have to have their needs satisfied at the lower levels. They need to feel physically, mentally, and emotionally safe. And if they don't, that's where their focus will be. So when you think about your workforce and what they're bringing to work each day, the more that we can help make sure their lower level needs are satisfied, that they feel safe in terms of the resources they have and their emotional support, the more likely they are to get into that performance space. I want to talk really quickly about self-determination theory and this idea of connecting people to what matters most. And this is a difficult thing to do when you are in a situation of distress. But when we think about some of these behaviors and the reasons why people might want to do them, we want to help people connect with their autonomous forms of motivation, because these are the long-lasting forms of motivation. These are the things that will keep people focused on a behavior when there are competing priorities or when it is difficult. And I'll talk a little bit more about how you might use this, but essentially when you're talking to employees, understanding what are the goals that they really value. And this is in a personal sense. This is not how many units do you want to produce today on the manufacturing floor? This is, as a person, what are the things that you would like to achieve in your life? How do you think of yourself and what are your personal values? What are the things that you enjoy? If you can understand these things about employees and help them connect it to the work they're doing, then they're more likely to be invested in that work. I also want to briefly talk about a topic called psychological safety. And this term has specific meaning, which is a shared belief held by members of a team that the team is safe for interpersonal risk-taking. If you have a psychologically safe team, people feel safe bringing their whole self to work, and they might feel safe doing things like talking about the vulnerability they feel now in the middle of the coronavirus pandemic. Again, because people sometimes will say, oh, this is all like softer stuff, I think it's really important to point out that Google put together a team called Project Aristotle to understand the factors that go into having really amazing work teams, like the highest performing work teams, what is going on there, so that they could start to replicate that as they build out other teams. And this team found that psychological safety was the number one predictor of whether a work team was high performing, whether they were really coming up with the results that the organization wanted. So this stuff is really, really important for the more traditional metrics of success, as well as the employee experience. And I would recommend checking out, there's a toolkit called Rework that Google has made available. If you just Google Rework by Google, double Google, you'll find it. And they have all kinds of actionable tactics that you can use in your workplace with your teams to try to create the sense of psychological safety. And then from a psychology perspective, I want to share one more model really quickly, which is called the broaden and build theory of positive emotions. And this is one that you've probably lived through as well yourself. When you are in a state of threat, when you feel anxious about something, or you feel like something bad is about to happen, maybe you're in an argument with somebody and you're really focused on winning the argument, your attention narrows down to just that threat. You're really just thinking about, how do I get out of this situation with my safety intact? It does not leave you any brain space to think creatively, to think expansively about solutions, to come up with new ideas. The broaden and build theory of positive emotions says that, if you're in that threat state, you're really focused on removing the threat. But if you can get somebody to a space where they're experiencing positive emotion, where they do not feel like they're in a state of threat, that gives them then the opportunity to let their brains make some of those more creative connections, to think broadly. And so there's a pretty robust body of evidence behind that shows that when people are in these more protected spaces, when they feel safe, they are then more likely to be creative, come up with good ideas, and be successful. So it's just yet another way to think about why it is so important to foster psychological safety, emotional safety, alongside physical safety. So 3 categories of ways that you can do this. First is increasing transparency as much as possible, giving people as much information as you can in a timely manner so that they don't feel like there might be something lurking out there that they don't know that's going to catch them unawares. Some of the ways this might show up are explaining rationales behind the decisions that are driven by the pandemic and the associated recession. I'll say one thing I really appreciate about working at MadPow is that our executive team, even in the best of times, is quite transparent with us. We have regular all-employee meetings where we learn about the state of the business, but during the pandemic, the frequency of those meetings has increased. And so even though there have been times where we've made decisions as an organization that felt uncomfortable, knowing the rationale behind it, knowing the data behind it, I think was certainly reassuring to me as an employee, and I believe to my colleagues as well. Setting clear benchmarks around return to normal, quote unquote, and sharing data about how you're progressing toward them. So making it clear, when we reach this point, we will do this thing. Helps people create those psychological models for what's happening and make sense of the world. Increasing the frequency of company or team meetings and communications. So I just mentioned with our all company meetings, that was one of the things that we did, but really reaching out often so that people know that you're there and that you haven't disappeared on them. Scheduling one-on-one or smaller team meetings as well. So don't just think about the macro organization, but think about the micro organizations of teams and working groups within, and use those as an opportunity to talk to people, for example, about what some of their personal goals are, to understand what might be going on with them in terms of cognitive load. What are the things they're anxious about? And are there any ways that you can be helpful about that? And even if you can't be helpful about that, having a person to talk to can really alleviate some of the stress. And don't forget about informal communication, especially as many workplaces that used to be in person are virtual for the time being. We're all missing out on some of those casual, friendly encounters. So think about, sending the quick note over email or Slack or whatever messaging system you use to just say, hey, and check in. The second category of things you can do to establish emotional safety is modeling support and flexibility. So one, this comes from Brené Brown, who many of you might be familiar with, and I would really encourage you look at her work, especially because I think she does a nice job of talking about things like being vulnerable while also being an organizational leader and in a position of power and respect. But one of the things she talks about is practicing selective vulnerability, sharing your own struggles and concerns. And importantly, this is not just airing all of your own, your own concerns to your team, but it's selectively showing that you too are human, that you worry about these things, and really creating that connection with people so that they feel trust and they feel like they can share their own struggles. Being proactive about flexible work arrangements if they're available. So, I mentioned before, there may be some types of workplaces where you can let people change which hours of the day they work so they can accommodate childcare or elder care. That's the sort of thing that if you proactively bring it up, you're sending a strong signal that it's okay to people to use those things. Whereas if somebody has to ask about it, they may not ask in the first place, or if they do, they may feel like they are not doing a good job or they're a lesser employee because of it. Organizing people to help others. Helping others is a great way to feel like we have some control over a hard situation. And so thinking about ways that you might organize your employees to volunteer to help folks who are less well off. So maybe collecting donations toward PPE for a local school, or if there's something else in your community that you're familiar with, or a cause that your employees have historically supported. This might be a nice time to marshal people to support that so that they can feel empowered. Like they're not, they're not just struggling through this, but they're also an agent of change. And then there will be probably people in your organization who are struggling more than others. And if there's any way that you can consider something like a crisis fund to help support them through these hopefully temporary hard times, again, that can really support your employees in feeling like they are helping others, but it can also help the employees who need this assistance feel cared for. And then the third category of things that you can do to establish emotional safety is really, I called it discussing the deep stuff, but this is like getting real, right? Digging in on what makes you tick and having these real human conversations. And it's related a little bit to that selective vulnerability. So, sharing your coping strategies. If you found ways that you can make your own work life run more smoothly in these times, sharing those with your employees and encouraging them to talk about it with each other. Explicitly asking people about their emotional well-being. Don't wait for them to bring up that they're struggling, but give them the opportunity in the space to tell you about it. And when they do, really listen. And again, you don't need to have solutions, but sometimes that listening ear goes a long way towards helping people feel like they have a space to express their vulnerabilities. In your one-to-one conversations with people, ask them about their goals, what matters to them, how are they finding ways in their changed lives to still live into the things that they value the most, and help them come up with ways to bring those values into their daily experiences. We're all experiencing a lot of turmoil as the tools and the coping strategies that we used in the past may not fit right now, and so we can help each other to come to a new way of accomplishing those things. And then reporting back to people on company achievements, really emphasizing how they contributed to results. I think this is a really important one, especially in light of some of what I've talked about, where people don't necessarily feel like their individual behaviors matter much when you have a crisis of this global magnitude. So as your company does good things, whether you're coming back online with your business or you're delivering on a client project, or maybe you've finally gotten into a position where you can reopen your hiring, letting people know that these things have happened, first of all, because employees are not always aware of the positive things that are happening with their company. And secondly, letting them know that their efforts contributed to arriving at this place. That can really help a lot. So I'd like to leave you with a question that's really been on my mind as I personally live through the changes the coronavirus has wrought on our world and the way we work. Do we have to return to exactly the way things always were? So I will be honest, I miss a lot of things about my world prior to March 2020. But I also think there are some aspects of the daily grind that were really challenging that we have the opportunity to rethink now. We can ditch some of the things that weren't working and adopt new ways of working that are more productive or more pleasant. And so as we go through this conversation about designing workplaces that help employees stay and feel safe, I'd really like to encourage us to take it as an opportunity to also reimagine some of the patterns and routines that we take for granted. Let's go back to that broaden and build category. Let's think expansively and creatively about what work could look like, so that hopefully when we're out of this global pandemic, we're better than before, not just back to normal. We've been forced into a situation where we know there's going to be enormous change, no matter what we do. So why not take control of it so that we're happier with the result? So thank you very much for your time. I'm looking forward to some of your questions and answers. And one thing I would really love to hear from you in the next conversation here are some of the ways that you've been able to feel more safe or to provide other people with a feeling of safety in your workplace. Thanks.